Good morning, everybody. I hope you are as excited as I am about this panel. I'm going to call up on stage 6 gentlemen who are not just thinkers, but doers. And I'm going to call them up in alphabetical order because you'll see 3 of them are businessmen who really had tremendous impact, and 3 come from multilateral agencies that really, truly facilitate what we need. Infrastructure is everything. It is both the kerosene we need for development. At the same time, if we don't have it, we know this, right? You can't have development. So, coming up on stage, first, please welcome Jaime Augusto Zobel de Ayala. He is the CEO of Ayala Corporation. This, as we all know here, is one of the largest, most diversified businesses. It's in real estate, banking, telecommunications, water, industrial technologies, power, infrastructure, healthcare, and education. He's been recognized by many local and international groups, but the one I like most recently, last September, is by the United Nations. He was honored as the first business leader of the Philippines and of Southeast Asia for its one of 10 pioneers in the Sustainable Development Goals. After him, from Japan, Shinya Ejima. He is the Senior Vice President of the Japan International Cooperation Agency, or JICA. Japan, since 1954, has been providing financial and technical assistance to developing countries through ODA, the Official Development Assistance. JICA is the world's largest bilateral aid agency, works in over 150 countries. After him, let's look and learn from a very dynamic speaker. This man, in almost every ASEAN or APEC panel, you'll see him, Tony Fernandes, the group CEO of AirAsia. He is one of the most recognizable entrepreneurs in our region. He co-founded Southeast Asia's first regional low-cost airline. I don't know if you guys remember this. He bought it for a token 25 US cents, and now it had tens of millions in debt and turned it around in 2 years. Next, Diwakar Gupta. He is the Vice President of the Asian Development Bank. He is the Vice President for Private Sector and Co-Financing Operations. It's ADB looks at private sector projects with a clear development impact, but has limited access to capital. This gentleman is the former Managing Director and CFO of the State Bank of India. He worked there for nearly 40 years, so he's got lots of insights for us. Fifth on stage, Thomas Hardy. He's the Director of the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, USTDA, helps companies create jobs through the export of U.S. goods and services for priority development projects. USTDA is in 4 ASEAN nations: Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, and Burma. And finally, well, he's critical because we're sitting, for you guys, in one of his creations. Ricky Razon Jr., he's the chairman of CEO of International Container Terminal Services, Inc. ICTSI manages and operates 31 ports and terminals in 18 countries. He's also the chairman of Bloomberry Resorts Corporation, so we couldn't be here if he wasn't here. So, you've got airlines, ports, infrastructure, and then the men who are going to help make it all happen. We're going to start. Hopefully it's a large panel, and what I want to do is to go to each of them and draw out ideas that we're going to need. If we want to build, how are we going to do this? What are the challenges? What are the problems? What things are they focused on? What keeps them awake at night? And we're going to take them in order that I called them up. So we're going to start again with Jaime. Jaime, the first step, I guess, where are we in your mind today?
Thanks, Maria. Well, this is an extraordinary time for ASEAN. I think if you take the ASEAN countries as a grouping, there is more growth taking place in our part of the world together with some of our neighboring countries than in any other part of the world. But with growth come challenges always. I think it was the ADB that mentioned that we'll be needing over $3 trillion of investment to support the kind of infrastructure that this growth will generate. It's an exciting time in that sense, but the challenges are there. And in order to be able to finance the kind of infrastructure needs of our region, we're going to have to rely both on multilaterals, government institutions, our own country's government and the private sector to all come together to address these needs. It's a great opportunity for all of us at this time, but also the challenges will be there. I think we were discussing earlier, Maria, that part of that growth has also come with a number of different demographic shifts. There's been a great deal of urbanization that's taking place in our region, and a lot of the growth in our region is coming from this movement towards urban centers. There is a need to upgrade, I guess, the infrastructure at these urban centers, and at the same time, there's a lot of consumption power that's beginning to take place with the younger generation moving up. I think if you take our region as a whole, we're demographically a very young and growing population. But with that, if you get the demographic dividend right, they will have the kind of spending power that's necessary. But all of this will come together and we will be able to harness, I guess, that growth if the infrastructure is in place. So that's the challenge we all face.
When you talk about that shift from urban to rural, in something like that, you know, you've got tremendous power. Who leads? I mean, do you wait for government? Do you lead? And what are the challenges?
Well, the shift is actually from rural to urban. And I think there's always going to be a tension that's going to take place, Maria, between putting resources out to the nations as a whole. It doesn't matter what country in ASEAN, or whether to overemphasize the urban centers. I've always argued that while politically it makes sense to obviously spread development money around the country, one has to overweight centers of economic growth as well. And I think the massive urban centers that you're seeing in Southeast Asia as a whole right now, be it Manila, Thailand, Indonesia, those urban centers are really catalysts for innovative growth in many ways, and need a great deal of infrastructure to support it. I would always argue that you have to overweight funding to that sector a little bit, only because they're such a driver of economic growth as we move forward.
And how does this sustainable development fit into the way you look at this?
Well, the issue of sustainable development is a very big one. There are many aspects of it. First and foremost, we live in a complex part of the world, Maria. There are natural hazards that we all face. Manila and the Philippines generally is within both climate change belts, earthquake belts, and the whole issue of resiliency is going to become important. So if you have urban centers that are at the crux of the growth side of the equation, we also have to make sure that they're protected in times of tremendous climate change and natural disasters. The Philippines is not immune to that. So from a sustainability point of view, I think disaster resiliency is one major issue. But of course, the big mantra for all of us is inclusive growth, getting large segments of the population to participate in the economic growth model, and that's another challenge of sustainability.
Thanks, Jaime. Shinya, let's talk about JICA and Japan's own priorities.
Thank you very much. I'm from Japan, and I'm representing the Japan International Cooperation Agency. Japan and JICA has been a good partner with ASEAN since the establishment of ASEAN 50 years ago. Particularly after 80s, we've been supporting the development of infrastructures in ASEAN region. For example, in the Eastern Seaboard Project in Thailand, and Batangas Port in the Philippines, and also the MRT Line 2 project in Metro Manila. But we are about to start the Metro Manila subway project. This is a project of the century, they call it. And recent years, Government of Japan and JICA is emphasizing on the quality infrastructure, for the achievement of the quality growth. So it means it shall be very inclusive and consistent with the strategy of the development, and also should take consideration of the social and environmental aspects very carefully. And we need to look at the life cycle cost of the project, so that each of the government or the users can maintain and for the project for a very sustainable manner. And thinking about the ASEAN in the future, the situation of each of the countries is slightly different. Some of the countries started their aging society, like Japan. but some others are still just started growth of the economy. So the connectivity is a key, yes. We're supporting the connectivity-related projects like a port, airport, and highways like Pan-ASEAN highway network through Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, Myanmar, further to India. These are the major infrastructure projects had been fully supported by Japan and Japanese government as a friend of ASEAN. Thank you.
Shinya, can I follow up with this and ask you, which strategy from your arsenal has worked the best? What would you say is a showcase project?
Well, showcase, as I mentioned, that was Eastern Seaboard Development Project in Thailand. And that we understand the strong initiatives taken by the government of Thailand was the key of the success. Many of the cases, government may hesitate to appoint private investors or public project because of the various reasons, but it consumed the time to make a decision for many, many years. Like I mentioned the Batangas port, but it took nearly 20 years to complete. It lost some opportunity cost for last 10 years, but the fair and transparent decision-making system is one of the key for the successful infrastructure development.
Fair and transparent. I mean, in the last few years, we've seen significant turmoil in Southeast Asia in terms of governance, right? How do you treat that? How does that affect the projects that you have?
Well, all the ASEAN countries had been democratized, and we have we share the common value, free and open infrastructure. So we believe in the democracy. So the fair and transparent decision-making system could be achieved through the democracy, we believe.
Fantastic, thank you. Thank you for your thoughts. I'm going to turn all the way to the right. Tony, put you on the spot. We're one of our region's best-known entrepreneurs, right? What keeps you awake at night? What has been successful, and what do you want to see shift?
Hey, thank you, Maria. Firstly, I want to congratulate the organizers for a fantastic event. Maybe the hotel could have been better, but apart from that, no, I'm only joking, I'm staying here.
So can your airline by a long way, huh?
So thanks for putting us all up. I just want to say firstly that ASEAN is doing well. I think we're a product of the success of ASEAN. We started 16 years ago with 2 planes, and when we first started, I thought, you know, when everyone was talking about China and India, I thought, what an amazing market we have here, 700 million people, 10 countries. So we went about trying to build an airline around that basis. And over the last 16 years, you know, our first year we carried 200,000 passengers. This year we'll carry 73 million passengers. And most of those have come from ASEAN. And so I think while there are many doomsday people out there saying ASEAN isn't moving fast enough, etc., in the last 16 years that I've been involved in business in ASEAN, it's moving great. Of course, we can always be better, and there's lots more, but I think we're moving in the right direction. In terms of infrastructure, obviously, for me, airports are very critical, but just before we talk about airports, I think one part of it is also getting to the airport. I think people build airports sometimes and forget about the connectivity to the airport. And in some cases, in some airports, it's actually more expensive to get to the airport than flying on AirAsia. So I ask all governments here and regulators to think about that as well. But I think for some reason, airports seem to take a long time to build. You know, if I had my way, I'd just ask Jaime and Enrique to go build them, and we'd have them in a couple of years. And so I would encourage more PPP, more private investment into airports. And secondly, I think we have to move away from just looking at the big cities. I think there's tremendous growth in secondary and tertiary cities around ASEAN and providing more direct connectivity to those cities. And I'm beginning to see now ASEAN governments beginning to look at developing airports outside their major hubs in the capital. So that would be a big wish of mine. Privatization. I think that's critical to get infrastructure going. And privatization from anywhere, whether it's foreign investment, whether it's local investment, whether it's JV. And secondly, don't just look at infrastructure within the big cities. Look at infrastructure outside. And thirdly, make sure there's connectivity to the airports that you build.
In the time that you've been working with ASEAN, and again, AirAsia has carried that ASEAN Airlines, right? In that time, I mean, the role of governments in each of the countries that you go in and out of, I mean, what has been the most successful in terms of how much or how little the government is involved?
Wow. I'm not going to answer that because then I'll upset all the governments that I said are not good. They're all fantastic. I love them all. I love all leaders of ASEAN. Give me more rights. No, I think obviously some governments have been more proactive, and it's clear to see those who have been. I think what I found in dealing with ASEAN governments is those that are accessible, willing to listen, have made the most progress. But I do see one of the dynamics I see in ASEAN, which is great, is that there's competition amongst ASEAN as well. And so if one country moves ahead, the others want to catch up as well. You know, we've seen success all over. There isn't one country that I say has done well because AirAsia is well represented across ASEAN. So I've seen lots and lots and lots of improvement. But we can always move at a faster pace, and that's why I encourage more private investment into infrastructure.
I'm going to follow up because I think you're perfect for this. You know, ASEAN once said this phrase, enlightened self-interest, and that's actually the way that we can all work together, right? But we've also seen AEC, for example, began in December 2015, but we've seen it trigger more isolationist tendencies in some of the countries. How can we have enlightened self-interest? How can you shift it from isolationist to actually truly working together?
Yeah, I mean, the issue is always when you go from single economies to a multilateral position, some nationalism will come up, vested interests will come up that try and prevent. My message has been, look, if you think about the people, ASEAN definitely works. If you think of the people in the country. And why have just one market when you can have 10 markets? If you're really going to be able to compete with the giants in China and India that are coming along, and the US and Europe, a bigger marketplace makes sense. So, but this is evolution, you know. I mean, Europe has been around since the war. America's been around much longer. NAFTA has been around for a short time, and but it's only 3 countries, really. So it takes time to bring down these kind of invisible walls, but it takes corporations and business to try and break this down. We can't just ask governments to do it themselves. We have to push and show the benefits, and AirAsia is a clear benefit of bringing down some of these barriers because so many jobs have been created and so many other airlines have come on the back of AirAsia. Every airline named after an animal is a low-cost carrier now. We have lions, we have tigers, we have all sorts. And that's been really good for the industry, you know, and it's created a very dynamic tourism market. ASEAN is seen as a tourism market. Within ASEAN, we have 10 amazing countries with such diversity. You know, within 4 hours of ASEAN, you have so much to see. In America, it's more or less the same. I'm sure you'll disagree, but it's more or less the same. But we have such depth. In Europe, it's more or less the same. So I do think bringing down the barriers have helped the people of ASEAN.
Fantastic. Very diplomatic, Tony. Let's move, Diwakar. I mean, the kinds of lessons that India can teach us. I mean, first let's start from the Asian Development Bank. You know, how do you look at ASEAN? What are the challenges ahead for us?
Right, thank you, Maria. Let me start by saying that it's a pleasure and a privilege for me to be here in such august company, both on the dais and in the audience. Now, what is the objective? if I go by what we set out to achieve in ADB, we want societies that are free of poverty. We want societies that have less inequity or inequality. Now, what is the scorecard? So if we go by the history, what happened in the US, the UK, and Japan in the 1800s happened in Asia 100 years later. And you've had 3 times investment in transport networks, you have 10 times investment in energy. And we've lifted 1 billion people out of poverty. Now, so I agree with Tony that we've done well, ASEAN has done well. Now, but where are we today? So you have 400 million lacking electricity, 300 million don't have safe drinking water, 1.5 billion don't have basic sanitation facilities. So in other words, we have a long way to go. Now, how can this be done? So I think it's sort of become axiomatic that to get all this development across, you need infrastructure. An ADBI study shows that a 10% increase in energy actually increases exports of that economy by about 7%. A 10% increase in financial services has a kicker of 5%. And of course, transport, roads and all are more expensive. A 10% increase in transportation leads to a 2% increase in exports. In other words, and this is only one metric that we are tracking. So in other words, we need huge investment. Now, what is the investment gap? 26 trillion by estimates of ADB itself up to 2030 for all of emerging Asia, and literally 60 billion a year in this region for infrastructure to come.
Sorry, just to clarify, 60 billion, is that right?
Well, 60 billion, yes.
60 billion dollars.
60 billion.
That's how much we need to just catch up, correct?
That's right.
In Southeast Asia, guys, we got to find $60 billion, and ADB will give it. No, sorry, continue.
Well, you never know. So, you know, with that kind of a requirement, where will the capital pools come from? So the good news is that there's a huge amount of money available. Emerging Asia saves 6 trillion a year. And the long funds, pension funds and all, pools of capital, 75 trillion is what is available. But what flows into infrastructure is barely 1%. So why does that happen? That happens basically because investors will only send in money where they are comfortable sending it. And in other words, you need to therefore create a matrix where the risk for investing is commensurate with the return. So I think there are a couple of things that need to be done in order to pull this infrastructure in. Basically, you will need to create conducive market conditions. And that means macroeconomic and political stability, proper dispute resolution, dependable laws and enactments, an enabling environment, dispute resolution. So those are the things that we will need to do. Their governments will have a very large role to play. The other problem is that most emerging markets have a very big problem with hedging dollars. You need strong local capital markets. So we need capital market reform where, so, you know, Philippines is lucky because they are flush with local liquidity, Indonesia likewise, but there are many countries who don't have liquidity and who would be it will be difficult for them to borrow dollars, that would be expensive. So we need deeper capital market reform. That could be through innovative instruments, that could be through rating agencies, that could be through information communications technology, bourses, exchanges, and so on. That is it. And the third pillar, which has already been touched upon by my co-panelists, this kind of money will not come from the government. You have to pull it in from the private sector, and there PPPs are an excellent way forward because they tend to leverage the relative strengths of both the parties. There are stuff like land acquisition, local laws, regulation, regulators, only governments can do. And then there is running business, which governments can't do. That has to be in private sector hands where efficiencies in execution can be leveraged. And I think that's really the way forward.
So let me pick up the public-private partnership since we haven't really talked about that yet. What is the most successful model? I mean, each country in ASEAN has tried this in different ways, correct? In your mind, which is the most successful? What are the traits that need to be there?
Well, it's very hard to say what is a successful model because, you know, I come from India, and India is a prime example where the PPP model for roads was great. And then suddenly one day it just came unstuck and you had everything. So it changes overnight. And it'll be hard to, but Malaysia has done a good job. Indonesia has done a fair amount on PPPs. Philippines is doing very well on PPPs. So they've, put together a very, very large amount in the last 15 projects, but, you know, it's continuously evolving. And challenges come at all points of time. As Tony mentioned, what are the challenges? They either come from vested interests. So if you want a water supply scheme, there could be a tanker mafia which won't allow you to operate. Or it could come from just sheer inertia of a bureaucracy. So, you know, things obviously need to change, but how will they change? It's interdepartmental, it gets referred from one place to another, you lose time, there is not enough continuity sometimes in the bureaucracy. Those are the challenges. Now, within that framework, you just need to, therefore, evolve models which will be equitable and which will be simple and dependable. And as I said, so there is no one size fits all, but we know exactly what is to be done. One big risk with PPPs is that one of the parties tends to transgress into the other's space. And that should not happen. In India, for example, it so happened that in the case of roads, land acquisition was left to private developers after a while. And now they can't do it. And so you languish.
Fantastic. Okay, I know I have two gentlemen still here. Tom, let's go to you next, yeah? Sorry. Oh, okay. So you are the only government official here on stage. So in your mind, I mean, what do you see? How do you look at Southeast Asia? And how did you choose the 4 countries that you did choose to put money in? And this would be Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, and Myanmar.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. When I was invited to be on this panel and I saw build, 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 it was brought joy to my heart because that really is the heart and essence of the U.S. Trade and Development Agency. For those that don't know, USTDA is the U.S. government's project preparation agency that is investing in the early critical infrastructure development focused largely on energy, transportation, and ICT. It's looking at how to design, finance a project, but do it in a way that, as my friend from JICA was saying, the quality. I think that that's the niche that U.S. Trade and Development Agency plays, and where we as an agency are getting a lot of traction, and particularly in the countries you mentioned, is we've got strong partners, both public sector and private sector. They're wanting to invest in infrastructure that's going to last the test of the time, looking at the total cost of ownership, the life cycle cost of investing. There's nothing inexpensive about investing the same thing twice. So we've seen a real uptick, particularly in Vietnam and here in the Philippines, of developing and investing in quality infrastructure. But also, before coming here, I think a lot of sitting in Washington, esoteric discussion of infrastructure development and doing the early project preparation. But before coming here, I was with the president in Da Nang, and we toured the Da Nang airport. That USTDA actually did the early project preparation that has really created a world-class airport that is supporting airlines around the region. And those are the types of programs that USTDA is investing in. And even here, I'm meeting later on today with an investment we've got for a geothermal power plant that is taking a little bit of US taxpayer money, investing it in the early project preparation of a geothermal power plant, 100 megawatts, that's introducing US technology, goods, and services to help them make an informed investment decision on bringing power to Luzon in the Philippines. And those are the types of investments that, as a US government, we're making, and we're having great success. We've never been more active in the region, and we've never been more successful.
We're going to share this mic. USTDA is focused a lot on procurement, and from what Shinya had said, right, transparency in coming out with these things. How do you find the balance between build, 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 pushing for that, and making sure that the process is free from corruption? I'll give you an example. The last administration, the Aquino administration's first year, the GDP was choked because it was too slow in pushing forward PPPs. I mean, pushing forward infrastructure projects. How do you find that balance?
I think it's all about finding the right partners. Particularly on the quality infrastructure, we've been working closely here in the Philippines and in Vietnam, and we have strong procurement authorities that are recognizing that they have to do something different. Simply investing in lowest cost has not gotten them what they want. So a lot of it's our own due diligence, but it's also having strong partners that have a professionalization. They have to recognize that they're taking their own taxpayers' money and investing in their infrastructure, and they're being held in this more transparent environment to be responsive to their own community. So we've got strong partners that are making changes, and they're seeing returns. I think early on, we're seeing results around the world outside of ASEAN, in Colombia, in Panama, and Ethiopia, where the work we've done on procurement reform has already changed how they're approaching, and they're coming back to us saying, we're getting value. We're getting value that we didn't used to have when we were looking at simply the lowest, cheapest cost option.
And again, to just echo, PPP, right?
Yes.
Best case scenarios there.
PPPs, it's interesting. I think much like my colleague was saying, that every country is different, but I think at the end of the day, when we look at public-private partnerships, it all goes back to having transparency, a sanctity of contract, sanctity of law, and a commitment on both sides. Because, you know, in public-private partnerships, they sound good, but at the end of the day, the public sector is giving something up. So they need to have a partner on the other side that's willing to go along and take it, but the public needs to be able to let that go a little bit to get the true economic benefit of the public-private partnership.
Fantastic. We have more. We should be talking more about that. The last but not least, Ricky. It's fun to hear his responses. So, Ricky, third generation, his family has been, you are the third generation in terms of marine cargo handling. You know, as you've built your businesses from the 80s until now, you know, what things stood out and what problems do you want solved?
Well, I'd rather speak in the context of first of all, I'd like to welcome everybody to Soler. I hope you're enjoying your stay here. For those who are staying here, enjoy our restaurant. First and foremost, I would say, although the forum is the ASEAN, I'd like to focus really just on the Philippines. To be blunt about it, I'm not really concerned by what the other countries are doing for themselves. I'm more concerned about the Philippines since we have a lot to do and a lot of catching up to do. Whether it be certain models, there's certain infrastructure which governments have to do. And there are certain other infrastructure projects which the private sector can do and participate. In our own business, as to answer your question, we've been a participant in really infrastructure and connectivity with the ports throughout our lives, for the last how many years, and in many countries. And some countries have experienced the same issues that others are. Some have other problems, some are at war, some are very prosperous. So it's hard to figure out really why some succeed and some don't. So I think that some of the other ASEAN countries have been ahead of us, some are behind, but we have to really, once and for all, focus and invest in our own infrastructure. We have one of the largest, I think second only to Indonesia in ASEAN. I know ASEAN is a good thing. About 1 week every year, they have these big meetings. I've been seeing it for the last 25 years, and everybody is united, 600 million people in the market, but the other 51 weeks, nobody does anything about it. people just concentrate on their own business, which is, to me, is really what my country has to get down to doing. No?
I'm going to follow that up. Actually, if you look at the World Economic Forum, its latest report actually shows that the Philippines is third from the bottom, just in front of Laos and Cambodia. How did we get to this point, and what should be done? I mean, now the government has build, but we still have to find how to move it forward, right? The concrete actions. What do you see?
Well, we got to that point with our own doing, no? We put ourselves in that point, and it's only us who can take us out of that. Nobody else can help us or do that for us. It's up to us. And my hope is that this administration is able to change the culture of how things get done in this country. The private sector, I think we have no problem. We're able, capable, and have proven that we can do things. So it's really the government organization that needs I use the word culture because that's what it is. It has to be, everybody's got to be on the same book on this. So until that happens, we'll be ahead of Laos and Cambodia.
So, you know what? I actually can't see our time. Okay, I think we have 1 minute left. Is that correct?
I think it's just been run.
Oh, okay, it's been, sorry, you'll just have to tell me when the time is up.
We've been here a long time already. So
I know. But to follow up, and I guess here, I'll throw it open to the panel, you know. You've each in different ways mentioned transparency. Shinya, Tom, you mentioned it, ADB, and each of the businessmen have mentioned it in different ways. What we've seen, though, in the last few years in ASEAN is a little bit of a rollback in both democratic reforms in some of the countries, and then greater charges of corruption in others. I won't name them all since we're being diplomatic, but beyond that, you know, how do we deal with this in ASEAN now? Can there be greater actions taken? Yeah, go ahead. Ricky, you start first.
I think the majority of ASEAN countries are not democratic. I think I slightly disagree with my Japanese colleague here. Philippines, though, is democratic. I say Indonesia, I get. Transparency is a tricky thing. For us, what's more important is to achieve and to reach an objective. If we focus on things like governance and transparency, we're still going to not get what we need to get done. My own view is that we need to build our infrastructure, our airports, our roads, the subway that JICA is, the JICA project, I think is the most important project for the Philippines. Second would be a new airport or several airports. So I think we have other things to worry about.
Okay, Jaime.
Yep, I guess building on Ricky's comments, one, you know, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, the financing needs are going to be tremendous. And of course, you can have your own government public funds come in, and you've got private sector funds. But in the end, I think we're going to get serious private sector funding, both and also from the multilaterals and from foreign investment coming in. You have to have a global set of standards that you live by. And I think when you're talking about governance and transparency, that's what it's all about. Our country is still low on the FDI list. We are not getting our equal share of foreign direct investment, but the potential definitely is there. And I think structures like the TPP, originally started by the US, or RCEP, initiated by China, is a way of getting our standards to come together. And I think one of the great moves that ASEAN is trying to make is to basically standardize the rules and regulations that govern the way we work. I think it is important to us to be able, as a country, to attract the investments necessary to bridge the gap in the kind of funding that it's needed to get our infrastructure up to its different level. That needs cooperation from all of us. A set of standards that we can all live by across ASEAN would help tremendously in creating that comfort level.
Fantastic. Tom, I'm going to pull you up on that.
Sure, thank you. I think on the transparency, that's not unique to the ASEAN. It's something that you have to do. But I think what we've seen over the last 12 days, traveling throughout Asia, is the tremendous economic growth that's taking place in the public sector in all of the countries we visited. And as the economic growth has come up, these new businesses, entrepreneurs, small businesses are now becoming medium businesses becoming large businesses. And they're taking, we've got better partners than we've ever had before. We've got better companies to work with, and companies that are willing to make investments in their countries, which is, as I said at the beginning, we've never been as diverse or as engaged in South and Southeast Asia as we are right now. And I think a lot of it's because it's on the right track. And you've got companies that are moving up the economic ladder and they're wanting to invest in their countries. And they're turning increasingly to the U.S. Trade and Development Agency as a vehicle to help them get the connections to U.S. companies, U.S. technologies, U.S. goods and services to help make those informed investment decisions for their infrastructure development.
I'm going to follow up on this, and I may toss this to Tony, because I like giving you hard questions. What we've seen globally, it seems, right, is in many ways, democracy has failed, at least if you look at a movement towards towards leaders. We'll talk about our countries, towards leaders who have greater sense of where they want to go, right? Has liberal democracy failed? If it's failed, elections in many of the countries has shifted it towards more strongman type rulers. The people, not enough has gone down to the people. The people's airline, right? Has enough gone down, and is democracy, as we've been saying on the panel, is that the only way to actually build, or are other systems of government as effective?
Well, I think it really depends. I mean, some countries, obviously, which have very strong leaders, they cut through the bureaucracy and things go very quickly as well. But I do believe in the long run, democracy is the only way forward, and a free press is the only way for a check and balance, etc. So governments in ASEAN will have to find a balance between transparency and moving things quicker. Just one more thing. Infrastructure is always a grandeur project. And in airports, for instance, everyone's talking about the biggest, highest, longest runway, etc. But really, for me, infrastructure is also building smaller things quickly. So we could build 40 airports in the Philippines and provincial areas very quickly and start stimulating the economies outside of Manila, while the solution on Manila is being sought, which I believe is Clark, and we should have a railway to Clark, and you've got a fantastic airport there, and build a highway through to Clark as well. But anyway, that's another issue. But sometimes I find when I sit in these infrastructure panels, people are always talking about massive infrastructure, but actually there's hundreds of little things that can be done to really grow local economies quickly. So for instance, for us, we want low-cost airports, which can cost, between $100 to $200 million, as opposed to a huge new airport, which is 5, 6, 7 billion. So again, infrastructure isn't just a massive project, but also smaller projects like what was mentioned about Da Nang, etc., where we're going to base our airline there for a start.
It was fascinating to see what Da Nang has actually done. Devata, let me throw to you the tricky questions of ownership in each of these countries, right? Some of our countries, many of these things are only for nationals. Again, it goes back to the isolationism and not actually being able to pull the group together. What do you see working in getting rid of that? Can ownership, critical utilities like transportation and power, can ownership of that, are our nations ready to let go of some of that and open it to everyone?
I sincerely feel that the issue is not so much about who owns. The issue really is about what is the governance framework and structure around that. So, we live in a real world, and the real world is beset with a lot of insecurity. at all points of time. So coming back to the democracy question that you had raised, why does it so happen that you see a pullback somewhere or you see stronger people coming in? Because it's the public will that is expressing a certain amount of discontent. And then it's for somebody to harness it or exploit it depending on whichever way you are looking at it. Now that is the reality of the situation. I think the same goes about ownership. So the crux of the situation is that whether it's owned by the government, whether it's owned by the SOEs, or whether it is in private hands, a level playing field should be created. If there is a level playing field, it'll all be fine. If the playing field is not level, there are going to be issues. And therefore, and there have to be proper controls so that if you give away foreign ownership, you don't really compromise on your sovereignty. And it's easy to do. Transportation, what problem could you have about sovereignty if it is in private hands? And of course, once you do that, you have to ensure that in private hands it remains equitable, it remains fair, and it remains accessible to everybody. So really it's about a level playing field. Ownership is not important. But having said that, governments must ensure that they are there as enablers. They are there to provide the superstructure. They can't run a hotel or an airline or why should governments should not be in the business of doing business. I think that's the basic.
That's interesting, and I'll pick up from that and throw it to Shinya. One of the biggest challenges is that some governments in our region are actually involved in business and are unfairly competing with private sector, with private business. How are you dealing with that? Do you think the ASEAN Economic Community is one of the ways that we can deal with this? I mean, again, it'd be interesting to hear your view.
Concerning the profitability of the project, and it's quite natural to demarcate the project between private and public. And I'd like to advise each of the government to don't listen so seriously any kind of offer from the private sector if the offer is very, how can I say, gorgeous or delicious. But I saw many cases that the government provided a kind of a concession to such a very gorgeous offer, but it didn't move after 5 or 10 years, so it wasted time. So the appropriate or very sound capability of the evaluation of the project proposal is very key to the project owner, the government. So we're making a kind of such a technical cooperation for the capacity building of the government sector through the various training program. And so we'd like to continue to contribute that kind of thing. Then one thing about corruption. For example, I think that technology may contribute to eliminate the corruption, like a custom system. In many ASEAN countries, we're providing technical cooperation to modernize the custom system to make it computerized, not handwriting invoice like we can identify number $3,000 or $8,000. It depends on the officer, but if it is computerized, then it's quite difficult to such kind of thing. So the technology is one of the key, not mighty tool, but one of the key tools to eliminate the corruption, I think.
Thank you. I know both Jaime and Enrique want to comment, but before they speak, guys, start thinking of your own questions. We're going to come to you after these two gentlemen.
Well, to be, if you really look at it, those that have the most advanced infrastructure are the ones that are not democratic. Yeah, the countries with the best infrastructure in the world are the dictatorships. I'm not saying I'm endorsing one or the other, but this is a fact. Europe has well advanced, but most of these were built 100 years ago, and they weren't democracies then. The United States is really the only one who's led the way with this democratic process and has been able to develop their country. That's because it's so vast and has so much resources. So tying democracy to development, I don't think it really works. just an opinion. I mean,
This is going to be interesting. I want to hear your questions. But in our region, at least, you've got a Singapore up top in terms of the most developed infrastructure.
it's not a democracy.
Correct. And then, well, it is. Singapore will say it is. It is. And then in terms of the bottom, though, you've got Cambodia and Laos. I mean, you've got it, you seem to have it split in both ways, correct?
But you have massive different levels of corruption as well, and resources.
Correct, correct.
So take your pick.
See, I told you he was going to be... Jaime, I think you had...
I'm not going to go Ricky's route, but let me just say that I believe in public-private partnerships. I'd like to pick up from something that Tony was saying earlier, and he was talking about our countries. Of course, he was focused on airlines and airports, but infrastructure is about ecosystems. You cannot just do one piece in and of itself. For, say, Tony to succeed in bringing tourism into our countries, he needs an ecosystem that goes beyond the airport. You need roads that link, transportations that link, and people have to be able to move from one place to another seamlessly. It's not just about one component or another. I think all of this cannot be done without the public sector and the private sector working together. And creating an ecosystem where one coordinates between the innovation and risk capital that private sector can bring to the equation and some of the longer term projects that the public sector and government can fund. That's a wonderful combination. One final comment on corruption. If you look at economic curve, as countries move up on a per capita basis, generally, if you look at the equation, corruption also declines. Sometimes we're focused on the issue of corruption at the early stage when countries are in the low per capita income level. I believe you can flip that around. Focus on getting the economy to grow, getting people empowered, and getting per capita income to go up. And I think naturally corruption, with the transparency and governance that comes with that growth and that higher level of earnings power, begins to come down. It's maybe just another way of looking at things.
No, that's interesting. But one of the things that we have seen, though, is... You can clap, please. What we've seen, though, is it seems like this trickle-down theory really hasn't worked, right? Do you agree with that, or do you think that that's still a workable plan?
Sorry, the question?
A trickle-down theory, right?
Yes.
Because in the end, how do we bring this down to our people?
Well, I think, I mean, the issues of inclusive growth now are very big, and they're very valid. One has to find mechanisms to get the growth of any particular sector or country to move down the economic chain. And there are many mechanisms to do that, even within our own group. We've fundamentally changed the way we do business and really tried to make ourselves much more relevant to a bigger component of the economic system in our country. There are mechanisms for that, Maria, and that can be done. And there should be an overt focus on that to be able to get that per capita income to be equally distributed as much as one can without killing the kind of entrepreneurial fervor that also drives economies. So I'm a believer in the capitalist system, but the capitalist system needs to be adjusted to the needs of the broader community, and I think the two things can be married.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's go take some questions from the audience.
Yes, I was in Hong Kong, Forbes at 100 with Jaime, Ricky, Tony. And we talk about a lot also about the elephant in the room, which we started talking corruption. 50 years ago, we were number 1 and number 2 in Southeast Asia. What happened? Corruption and criminality. Without corruption and criminality, we should be number 19th economy in the world. When the Americans were here, we had 200 airports and runways. Who land grabbed those? 50 years ago, we had more lungs of the city in Metro Manila, more open spaces. 1986, Singapore had 36% open space. Now, 45% open space. Because the rest of the world is people first, or social equity, planet Earth and environment. Then we can talk about profit. It seems in our part of the world, it's still profit, 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 never mind traffic. Open spaces are the lungs of the city, but they are all disappearing. It was very nice hearing from Joey about inclusive growth. These are nice sound bites. I hope it's put into practice. Maybe the Americans, we copied your mistakes also before all crisis. Los Angeles, Hollywood, gated communities. I met 3 mayors of Los Angeles. They're announcing to the rest of the world those are 70-year-old mistakes, and yet in our country, You still have gated communities strangulating our central business district. And the workers, employees of this business district spend 6 hours a day in traffic because they are strangulated by gated communities. I'm glad Jaime is here. Maybe he can be the exemplar. And Joey's here. His father was against opening up the gates of Ford's Park when I was a consultant of the barangay. And when many people here from Ford's Park, since open spaces are disappearing, we might as well open up Ford's Park. And I'm sorry I hurt some people. I spoke in Mumbai.
Your question.
Yeah. The question is very nice sound bites. As Ricky said, 51 weeks later, we don't walk the talk. I'm not that young anymore. 40 years ago, I helped Dubai. I was named urban planner. Look at Dubai today.
Yep.
And there are oligarchs all over the world, like Moscow, Dubai, Singapore, Hong Kong, US. But the government controls them. Thank you very much indeed. And can we do that here? Not just talk about the sound bites, but let's walk the talk. Can we do it? And be the exemplars.
So as a question, what you want
can we do it here? Maybe after 10 years, we'll host it again. We might have do a report card, or the US government. I work with USAID projects, flood control, transportation, traffic. When I was 21 years old, they are still suffering from analysis paralysis. Circumferential Road number 6 was proposed by the Americans 1945. Maybe the Americans may want to cajole us, or USAID, go back to those unfulfilled projects. Can we do that, sir? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your thoughts. So what we're seeing here is really, let's lift it. Let's take out the nice words, but what is the reality that needs to be addressed?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear what the question is.
So essentially, policies that have been put in place that actually go against what we have been saying here on the panel. And he focused on things like traffic. I mean, I guess you didn't hear it. So who of the gentlemen on the panel would like to take this? How can we actually move beyond nice words, and what things need to be addressed? Ricky, I hear you. You're going to talk.
No.
No?
I just want to see one big thing built first. Let's solve a couple of things before we try to solve everything.
Okay. Jaime, any words?
The question, Maria? So, what was the issue?
I'm paraphrasing. I think what he said, and please correct me if I'm wrong, what he said is that we've been speaking in nice language, but that the reality doesn't match it. Yeah. Correct?
I can't imagine Ricky was speaking in nice language.
Yeah, that's why I gave him the mic first.
He said all governments are the no democracies in ASEAN.
I guess my response...
He wants to be a dictator in the Philippines.
My response to that is actually, I think we've achieved a lot as a country, and I don't think we give ourselves enough credit for how much we've achieved. I mean, we've been growing at a fairly consistent rate for 6 to 7%. I guess maybe the argument I just want to put on the table, Maria, and it follows to your issue of inclusiveness, is at 6 or 7% as a country, if you extrapolate that forward, and given the growth of our population, we'll actually be standing still. And we're very driven as a country by consumer growth, which is great, and many other countries are fighting to get it, but you have to couple that with investment-led growth. Those are the two sides of the economic equation. If you get the two together and really harness it, and we're quite low as a country on the investment-led part, but if you can kick that in, then you start to move up to the 7, 8, 9% growth, and that's what creates a per capita income growth that then moves us up to middle income level. And that's what the inclusiveness starts to kick in. But frankly, at 5 to 6%, while these are good numbers and we should be, of course, happy with them, it's almost as if you're walking on a treadmill. You extrapolate that to our country, say 10, 20 years from now, with our population growth, we'll still be in a similar situation. We'll be growing, but standing still. We have to kick up that growth to the 7, 8, 9% in order to make meaningful change to the population at large.
Tom, and then Rick.
I think this is happening everywhere around the world. It's not just here. This is happening in the United States. In this region, you've got 6, 7, 8% growth, and the growth is outstripping the investment in infrastructure. I mean, this is a conversation we're having in the United States. We were talking in the green room beforehand of, the amount of money that needs to be invested in infrastructure to keep up with economic growth is astounding. And the traffic here is little different than it is in Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles and Chicago. We all are suffering from the need for balancing the funding and investment in economic or in infrastructure, which goes back to your question about needing to figure out how to do public-private partnerships and drive investment into these and do it in a way that keeps up with the economic growth. There's not a simple answer. I mean, everyone's striving for the highest economic growth, but we're not keeping up with that investment in the infrastructure to sustain it, to make sure the planes are running on time and the people are getting to the passenger terminals in time. It is a problem everywhere.
Ricky?
Again.
I think we're coming out of, well, from, yeah, and I can pick up from what Jaime said, right, which is in the end, while we have high growth rates now, it's still high in comparison to the
and you need to increase your capacity if you want to grow. Sooner or later, it's going to be strangled if you're not increasing capacity, like any business. And the trickle-down sustainability, it's really, that's what it's about, is having the capacity to accommodate all the economic activity. I mean, people like us, we trickle down to the next level. The next level's got to trickle down to the next. It's not just all business trickling down to everybody. It involves the government, it involves us.
Question, please.
Good morning. My name is Imad Age from Sweden, Ecolo Group. We do sustainable toilet solutions. As Mr. Gupta said earlier, some of the infrastructure missing is actually sanitation, right? And as Mr. Fernandes later on said, that it's better to focus on smaller and faster development than bigger infrastructure. And as we see it as the sanitation, when it comes to sanitation, it takes
answer.
Somebody is on the mic.
Sandali. Ang tawag dito.
Sorry, yeah. We're hearing you, whoever. Please go ahead and ask us the question.
Yeah. And when it comes to infrastructure, when it develops sanitation, it's a huge investment to do the infrastructure, and it's a huge investment to do the sewage treatment plants. Is it not something we have to think about when it comes to a quicker development in terms of sanitation, involving the right investment when it comes to a lot of aid actually comes to sanitation, but then they choose the cheap, non-sustainable, short-term sanitation solution. At the end, it doesn't fill the purpose. So I want to see how we can do a business model where a PPP aids a lot of efforts to solve sanitation come into the picture, and the fastest way, on-site treatment system where everyone is gain benefit of it and eliminate the health and environmental issues in big projects, scaling up with sanitation solution. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Diwakar, please.
You know, what you're saying is absolutely right, but life is not about black and white. There are several shades of gray. So, you know, we are at a place where we have 0 and we want to get to a place where we'll have 100. It's not binary. So while you are absolutely right, I know about India because it's a great example. There's a huge deficit over there, which you know very well. And there has been a huge campaign which has been launched. And in that campaign, you see all kinds of things. There are success stories. There are people, you know, women who had refused to marry because there wasn't a toilet in the home, and all that is changing. But there are also toilets that are executed which are very bad and, you know, they are dysfunctional. I think I am an eternal optimist, and I think great should not become the enemy of good. So at different points of time, you will have all kinds of things, and eventually the market will reach a critical mass where the substandard or the not acceptable will get eliminated. the path to it is going to be messy. And I think even today, apart from the fact that there is substandard stuff, there is some cutting edge stuff. I'm sure your firm is doing something which is really at the cutting edge of technology. And I think those will be the examples that will lead others to follow, and they will become bigger over time.
Thank you. Another question from the audience. Should I give you my... Here.
Hello. My name is Aaron Jira. I'm the ASEAN Business Advisory Council from Thailand. I just want to let you know that you may have heard of this, the EEC. This is the economic...
ASEAN Economic Community.
No,
EEC.
Not AEC. EEC, Eastern Economic Corridor from Thailand. This is a flagship project by the government of Thailand that's going to try and bring in FDI. Now, this is something that's really big, and we want the ASEAN friends and other friends around the world to come and invest in our country. My question is, I know Ricky Razon's business is very big here, and he's been very successful. Whether we could, get some help for infrastructure from this particular, organization, and also, AirAsia, of course. The thing is, the opportunity is yours. The challenge is ours. And we would like you to come and invest in Thailand.
Yes.
We are asking for any cooperation that you might be willing to give in terms of helping us improve our infrastructure in that area. This is not a new economic zone, but the country is trying to perfect the eastern seaboard that has a lot of petrochemical complexes, electronic businesses, and the automotive industries.
Thank you. I think Tony will take this question.
So we're very aware of EEC. In fact, we're big believers in it. And we're working with the government on Utapao Airport. And again, talking about what I earlier said, in building a low-cost airport which could serve the region. So I think more projects like this is great. And the fact that it is being split up into private-public partnership makes a lot of sense. So, I applaud Thailand for the EEC. I think it's a brilliant idea. And we at AirAsia are very heavily committed to it, from maintenance and also the airport at Utapao.
Go ahead. You wanted to
regarding EEC, because that is an upgrading of the Eastern Seaboard Development Program in the past, and that we understand